There's something eerie about small towns. Maybe it's the silence, or the way the streets feel too still at night, like the world's gone on without you. Everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. You wave to your neighbor, maybe borrow a cup of sugar, or ask them to watch your kids while you run errands. You trust people more, because this isn't the city. This is home, and for the people of Wichita, Kansas. That trust was everything. Back in the 1970s, Wichita was the kind of town that felt safe, like really safe. Families left their doors unlocked. Kids played in the streets until sunset. People went to church every Sunday. Same pews, same faces. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and backyard barbecues. Nothing felt out of place, but something was. Someone was, and no one saw it coming. Not the neighbors, not the police, not even the people living right next door, because sometimes the real monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they're just blending in. Dennis Rader was a quiet man, a little awkward maybe, soft-spoken, middle-aged, lived in a modest house with his wife and 2 kids. He worked at a DT, the home security company, installing alarm systems for people who were scared of break-ins. That job, ironically, gave him access to homes all over Wichita. He was also a leader in his local church, a Boy Scout troop volunteer, a man you'd probably forget after meeting once or twice. He had glasses, a mustache, wore polos and slacks, and drove an unremarkable car. He was the kind of guy who got annoyed if you didn't mow your lawn properly, strict about rules, seemed like a stickler for details. Nobody looked at Dennis Rader and thought, killer. And yet, that's exactly what he was. The truth is, the story of Dennis Rader doesn't start with blood. It starts with boredom, with a fantasy, and with a hunger he couldn't explain. Dennis had always felt different. Even as a teenager, he had dark thoughts, not just daydreams, full-blown fantasies about control, about power, about domination, but he kept them hidden. On the outside, he was just another young man trying to get by. He served in the Air Force, got married, had kids, lived the American dream. But in his mind, he was building something else, something darker, something terrible. It started with drawings, violent ones, then notes, then sketches of women in cages, or tied up, or worse. Over time, he gave these fantasies names. K-projects, he called them, little worlds in his head where he could do what he wanted, where he had all the power. And one day, it wasn't enough to just think about it anymore. In January of 1974, Wichita was still caught up in New Year's resolutions and cold winter mornings. Snow was still piled up on front lawns. The holidays had just ended. Kids were back in school, and on the morning of January 15th, something unthinkable happened. The Otero family, a husband, a wife, and 2 of their children were found dead in their home. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing was taken. There were no signs of forced entry, and whoever had done it had taken their time. The police had never seen anything like it. Not in Wichita. The victims were Joseph and Julia Otero, along with their son, Joseph Jr., age 9, and their daughter, Josephine, age 11. It wasn't random. It was cold, calculated, personal, and the killer had left. Almost no trace behind, but he had left something else. The start of a game. Wichita changed overnight. News of the murders spread fast. Parents pulled their kids from school. Hardware stores ran out of deadbolts. People started peeking out their windows, jumping at sounds in the night. Nobody knew who did it or why, and the idea that it might happen again, that fear hung over the town like a cloud. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader went to work like normal. He ate dinner with his family, took his kids to school, sat in the pews on Sunday morning, and in his mind, I was already planning the next one. Dennis didn't just want to kill. He wanted people to know it was him. He wanted credit, and more than that, he wanted to be remembered. Months after the Otero murders, a letter arrived at a local newspaper, typed, neat, precise. The author claimed responsibility for the killings. But not just that. He described details only the killer could know, and he signed it with a name no one had ever seen before. BTK, 3 letters, 3 steps. Bind, torture, kill. That was his method, his ritual, and now his signature. The police were stunned. Was this real? A hoax? Some sick prank? But as more letters followed, they realized it wasn't a joke. BTK was real, and he was just getting started. What made Dennis Rader so terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how normal he looked doing it. He wasn't a drifter or some stranger hiding in alleys. He was a neighbor, a husband, a dad. He worked in your house, sat behind you in church, and the whole time he was keeping secrets. Big ones, horrible ones. The man who installed alarms was the reason people needed them, and for decades he got away with it. But the thing about secrets, they never stay buried forever. January 15th, 1974 was cold. That kind of bone-deep cold that makes the air bite your skin even after just a few steps outside. It was early morning in Wichita, Kansas. The city still had snow piled against the sidewalks, frost on windshields, and the kind of silence that only happens before a school day begins. But in one quiet neighborhood on Edgemore Street, a nightmare was unfolding inside a small tan house with white trim, and nobody heard it happen. The Otero family was known as quiet, respectable, a bit reserved, but friendly, the kind of people who waved at neighbors but didn't pry. Joseph Otero, the father, was a decorated Air Force veteran. His wife, Julie, was a loving mother. They had 5 children, but only 4 were living at home. On that morning, only 3 were there: 11-year-old Josephine, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and 15-year-old Charlie. The others had already left for school by the time everything went wrong at around 8 a.m. Someone knocked on the front door. It was Dennis Rader to the world outside. He was still just a man, an average man, a man with a job, a wife, and no criminal record. But to the Oteros, in that moment, he was something else. Something not human. Something that didn't flinch, didn't feel. Something cold. Dennis had been planning the attack for weeks. Kay referred to it in his notes as Project Little Mex, a disgusting nickname he gave based on the family's Hispanic background. This wasn't random. He had stalked the house, learned their schedule, watched them. That morning, he carried with him his hit kit, rope, tape, knives, plastic bags, everything he needed to do what he had fantasized about for years. Damn. Once he was inside, it didn't take long for things to spiral. He threatened the family with a gun, said he was a wanted criminal, just needed food and money and a getaway car. He told them if they cooperated, no one would get hurt. It was a lie, a way to gain control. Dennis Rader didn't want money. He wanted power. He wanted fear. He wanted to watch. By the time the sun had fully risen, the house had gone still. Curtains were drawn. No one answered the phone. The kids didn't show up to school. And inside that home, 4 people were dead. The father, Joseph, was found face down on the floor, a cord still wrapped around his neck. Julie, the mother, lay nearby, strangled and bruised. 9-year-old Joseph Jr. had been suffocated with a plastic bag over his head. And 11-year-old Josephine was discovered in the basement, hanging from a pipe. It was not just murder. It was theater. Cruel, deliberate, controlled, and Dennis Rader had loved every second of it. It would be hours before someone knocked on the door. That person was Charlie, the 15-year-old son. He had stayed late at school that day. When he got home, the house was too quiet. He walked inside and found the bodies of his parents and siblings. He ran to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. Wichita PD responded quickly, but they weren't prepared. They didn't understand what they were looking at. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about money or revenge. Nothing had been stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. It was methodical, precise. The killer had even taken time to wipe down surfaces, remove evidence, and stage certain parts of the crime scene. But the most disturbing part, it didn't feel like someone trying to hide what they'd done. It felt like someone wanted them to see it. News of the murders didn't take long to spread. Wichita, a city of less than 300,000 people at the time, was stunned. Families locked their doors for the first time. Hardware stores ran out of chains and bolts and alarm systems. For weeks, nobody felt safe. People started keeping baseball bats near the front door and sleeping with lights on. Even the police were shaken because there was no suspect, no confession, no real leads. Who could kill 4 members of a family, 2 of them children, and then disappear without a trace? And, more importantly, would they do it again? Back at his own home, Dennis Rader was having dinner with his wife and kids, washing dishes, watching the news, listening to reporters talk about his crime, and smiling. The thing about Dennis Rader is that the killings were never just about the act. He wasn't interested in getting away with it and disappearing. He wanted more. He wanted fame, control, fear. So months after the Otero murders, he decided to write a letter. He typed it neatly. No handwriting to trace. No fingerprints. He addressed it to a local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle. Inside, he claimed responsibility for the murders, described the crime scenes in detail only the killer could know. But what really made the letter unforgettable was the signature. BTK, bind, torture, kill. That was his method. That was his name. He had given himself a brand, a persona. He even suggested police print it in the paper so people would know what to call him. The police were horrified. They had never seen anything like it. Not in Kansas, not in the Midwest, not in a place where things like this weren't supposed to happen. The letter wasn't manic. It wasn't messy. It was calm, cold, almost businesslike, like he was checking in, like it was a game. The BTK name stuck. The media started using it. People whispered it over fences. Kids heard it from there. Parents and parents from the evening news. It was more than just a nickname. It was a presence. People started looking over their shoulders, wondering if they'd be next. Wichita felt different now. Something had shifted. Trust was broken. Because if someone could do that and still walk among you unnoticed, then what else was hiding behind a neighbor's smile? Meanwhile, Dennis Rader was writing. Not just letters, but journals, diaries, stories. He called his victims projects, gave them code names, plotted their routines, drew maps of their homes. Sometimes he'd go back and visit the scenes of his crimes, just to feel it again. He loved watching the police fail, watching the public panic, watching the news. It fed him, but more than anything, he wanted to be remembered. He wanted people to know the name BTK. The police, for their part, were desperate. They pored over evidence, interviewed hundreds of people, chased down every tip. But the killer had been careful. No fingerprints, number, DNA, no eyewitnesses. There was nothing to hold on to except fear and Dennis Rader. He was already planning the next one. It wasn't enough to kill. Not for him. The rush faded too quickly. The silence afterward was too heavy. The act, the thing he did, left a void in him. Like a child needing attention, Dennis Rader didn't want to be ignored. That was the thing most people didn't understand. He wasn't killing to disappear. He was killing to be seen. In the months after the Otero murders, Wichita was on edge. People looked twice at strangers. Newspapers posted updates daily. The police were exhausted, chasing shadows, and Dennis was soaking it all in, watching from his recliner, flipping between channels, wondering how long it would take before they said his name. But they didn't. They called it a tragedy, a brutal, senseless act, but no one gave him credit. Canned that. Burned. He wanted people to know, so he sat down at a typewriter, not in some underground bunker or flickering basement. Just a normal Kansas room, beige walls, carpeted floor, table lamp dot outside. Birds chirped. Inside, he was creating a legend. He typed slowly, carefully, making sure every sentence hit just right. The letter he crafted would become one of the most chilling communications in American crime history. He started by claiming responsibility. He gave details, intimate ones, about the Otero crime scene, things that only the killer could have known. He described how he cut the phone line, how he made the family lie down, how he took his time. He made it clear that this wasn't a one-time event. This was a pattern, a system, a ritual. He referred to himself as a serial killer. And back then, in 1974, that term wasn't even in wide use yet. Then, he asked something strange. He asked the newspaper to help him come up with a name. He suggested a few himself: the Wichita Strangler, the Asphyxiator, or simply BTK. Bind, torture, kill. That was his method. And he wanted the world to remember it. This wasn't a confession. It was a manifesto, one that dripped with ego, arrogance, and control. Dennis Rader wasn't just telling them what he had done. He was building a brand. The letter was sent to the Wichita Eagle, one of the city's largest papers. The staff there were horrified. At first, they thought it was a hoax, but when police reviewed the contents, they knew it was real. And now, they had something far worse than a killer. They had someone who wanted to be famous. Let's stop for a second. Imagine being a detective in Wichita back then. You're working double shifts, no DNA tech, no internet. You're staring at crime scene photos of a murdered family, trying to piece together what happened. And then this letter lands on your desk, typed, cold, precise, and it ends with 3 words that'll haunt you forever: bind, torture, kill. The police didn't release the letter right away. They kept parts of it quiet, hoping to use the details to identify future crimes. They didn't want to feed his ego, but that wouldn't stop him. Dennis Rader had found something new, a voice, and now that he had it, he wasn't going to shut up. In the years that followed, he sent more letters, sometimes to newspapers, sometimes to the police. Sometimes he'd just leave messages in public places, dropped in parks, stuffed in cereal boxes, or taped to street signs. He wanted them to look for him, to chase him. We'd know his name. He'd signed his letters with fake names, use codes, include puzzles and poetry. Sometimes he'd talk about his projects, victims he was watching. Sometimes he'd reference past killers like Jack the Ripper and compare himself to them. He craved status. But more than that, he craved attention. He created a character, BTK, and treated him like a celebrity. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a storyteller, and in Dennis's twisted mind, every murder was a chapter. Every letter was a press release. Every scream was applause. He talked about his hit kit. He called his attacks projects. He even created a list of classifications, fantasy levels, victim types, stalking stages. This wasn't chaos. This was a hobby, an obsession, and the scariest part, he was still living a normal life. Dennis Rader was, on paper, the picture of suburban.com. He was married, had 2 kids, worked for DT installing home security systems, attended Christ Lutheran Church every Sunday, volunteered with the Boy Scouts. He mowed his lawn, watched TV, grilled burgers, smiled at neighbors. But behind that dull, ordinary shell was a man who had made himself into a myth. Let me take you into his head. When Dennis stalked a victim, he didn't see them as a person. He saw them as a project. He'd watch them for weeks, track their routines, note when they left for work, what time they walked the dog, who else lived with them. He'd write it all down in journals, private documents filled with violent fantasies, diagrams, codes, and sketches. And then, when the moment was right, he'd strike. And afterward, he wouldn't just disappear. He'd narrate it. In 1977, after another murder, he sent a letter to Cake TV, a local news station. This time, he wasn't subtle. He listed all the murders he claimed. Credit for some the police hadn't even linked yet. He gave victim names, dates, exact details. And again, he signed it. BTK wasn't just playing games anymore. He was taking ownership. He wanted Wichita to belong to him. At this point, police were desperate. They had multiple crime scenes, multiple victims, a growing pile of letters, but no suspect. BTK didn't leave fingerprints. He wiped down every surface. He wore gloves, brought his own rope, left almost nothing behind. He wasn't a genius, but he was careful. And in the 70s and 80s, careful was enough. There were task forces, undercover teams, psychological profiles, but every lead went cold. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. After 1979, the letters stopped. Killings, as far as police knew, stopped. 2. Wichita exhaled. Slowly, people started to believe he was dead or locked up for something else. Maybe he moved away. The fear didn't go away, but it faded. Time passed. New detectives came in. Old files gathered dust. The name BTK became a ghost, mentioned only in whispers, and for over 25 years, there was silence. But silence, with BTK, never meant peace. Dennis Rader wasn't gone. He was just resting, raising his kids, going to work, living. Boring, quiet life. But all that time, he was still writing, still fantasizing, still watching. And deep down, he was waiting for his name to be spoken. Again, waiting to step back into the spotlight, waiting for his audience, because in his mind, this wasn't over. BTK was just on intermission. Fear is strange. It can sneak in slowly, like a breeze under a door. Or it can hit like a hammer to the chest. But in Wichita, Kansas, fear had a name, BTK. It stood for bind, torture, kill. But it meant something more. It meant someone was watching. You, that your windows weren't safe, that your locks didn't matter, that a stranger could enter your life, rearrange everything, and leave nothing but silence. And worse, he might come back. After the Otero family murders in 1974, Dennis Rader should have faded into obscurity. Most killers, even the worst ones, vanish after their first crime. They panic, they run, but not Dennis. He didn't feel fear. He felt disappointment because no one said his name. No one admired his work. He wasn't in the headlines, and to Dennis Rader, that was the real crime. So he wrote again. He typed out more letters. Not just confessions, but lessons. Wichita had forgotten about him too quickly. So he reminded them in chilling clinical detail. He told them what he'd done, what he planned to do, and who might be next. He described his victims as projects. He used initials instead of names, gave each one a title. He wrote like a man building something, like an artist sketching a blueprint. The letters were terrifying, not just because of what they said, but how they said it. There was no anger, no remorse, no emotion at all. They were cold, strategic, detached, like a man filing reports. He bragged, teased, threatened. He mocked police for failing to catch him. He taunted detectives, giving just enough detail to prove he was real, but never enough to lead them to him. He even coined phrases, words like Factor X, something he claimed compelled him to kill, beyond his control. He wrote about his childhood, about how he was born to kill. He claimed to be possessed by something bigger than himself. But behind the fancy talk was just Dennis, a man with a blank stare, a steady job, and a head full of fantasies. And the scariest part, he really believed it. Each new murder became a performance. Each letter, a review of his own work. He watched the news, clipped newspaper articles, taped himself on TV when they mentioned BTK. He was both the killer and the audience, the director and the critic. And in every letter, there was one phrase he came back to, over and over. I will be watching. That was Dennis's greatest thrill. Not just the murder, not the escape, but the control. He wanted people to change their behavior because of him, to live in fear, to lock their windows and check their closets, to flinch at shadows. He didn't just want to end lives, he wanted to rewrite them. His next confirmed murder happened just months after the terrorized. It was 1974. Her name was Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old college student. She lived with her brother, Kevin. They returned home that day to find something was off. The house felt strange, and then a man stepped out from the shadows. It was Dennis. He had broken in, cut the phone line, and waited, just like before. But this time, things didn't go smoothly. Kevin Bright fought back, fought hard. He was shot twice, once in the face, but miraculously survived. But Catherine didn't make it. Dennis stabbed her multiple times, then fled. He hadn't expected a fight, but he escaped again, and now he had a new name to add to his growing list. Months later, another letter arrived, typed, polished. In it, Dennis confirmed both murders, the Oteros and Catherine Bright. He laid out details no one else could have known. He mentioned the projects by name. He referred to Kevin Bright, the survivor, and admitted the failure. It bothered him that Kevin had lived. It had gone off script, but the letter made one thing very, very clear. BTK was still out there, and he wasn't done. Over the next few years, the pattern continued. He would stalk, observe, plan, then strike. Sometimes weeks later, sometimes years, but the methods were always similar. Cut the phone lines, force entry, or wait inside. Bind the victim. Tease his hit kit. Ropes, cords, tape, plastic bags, and always take his time. He didn't kill in a frenzy. He crafted his murders. One of the most chilling cases was Nancy Fox, killed in 1977. Dennis had stalked her for weeks, planned every detail. After he killed her, he didn't just walk away and hope for the best. He called the police. Yes, he dialed 911 from a payphone and calmly reported a murder. Gave the address. Hung up. He wanted them to find her, to see his work, to panic, and they did. The pattern was horrifying, but unpredictable. His victims varied. Young women, older women, a family, different neighborhoods, different times of day. There was no clear profile, no pattern detectives could follow, just shadows and strings, silence, and every few months, a new letter, each one more confident than the last. He talked about killing as if it were a job. He signed off with nicknames, sometimes BTK, sometimes Bill Thomas Killman, other times weird aliases that made him sound like a comic book villain. But he wasn't laughing, he was documenting. He wanted the public to know he was smarter than the police, that he could outplay them, outlast them, outthink them, and for a long time he did. Meanwhile, back in his regular life, it was still just Dennis, still fixing alarms, still leading a Boy Scout troop, still taking his kids to school. He'd kill someone on a Tuesday and be back at church on Sunday morning, smiling, shaking hands, quoting scripture, and no one suspected a thing, because serial killers were supposed to be monsters, unstable, unhinged, obvious. But Dennis Rader was none of those things. He was average, forgettable, the kind of man you'd ask to watch your house while you were on vacation. And he liked that. The longer he went uncaught, the bolder he became. His letters got stranger. He wrote poems about his victims, drew diagrams of crimes, made puzzles with ciphers. He even tried to publish a BTK biography, but always he kept his distance. He never mailed from his own home, never left fingerprints, never stayed too long at a scene. He was careful, disciplined, and that discipline made him deadly. Wichita was crumbling under the pressure. Every new unsolved crime made people wonder, was this BTK? Every prowler, every break-in, every scream in the dark, could he be back? He'd disappear for months, sometimes years, then reappear with a letter, or worse, a body. He controlled the narrative, he controlled them, and in the background, like a whisper, was always that phrase, "I will be watching." He wanted them to know he was watching them lock their doors, watching the fear grow, watching detectives fumble in the dark. And with every new letter, every victim, every headline, he got stronger, more confident, more certain that he'd never be caught. And for over 30 years, was right. Some serial killers are driven by rage, others by revenge. Some kill because they lose control. Dennis Rader was different. He killed because it made him feel powerful. He killed because it made him feel seen. But most of all, he killed because it made him feel like God. He said it himself. In one of his letters, I find the hunt and control of another person, even before I do them in. They are mine. It's like a game of chess. He didn't see victims. He saw pieces on a board. He wasn't a man who snapped. He was a man who planned. From the outside, he was an ordinary father, husband, church leader. From the inside, T was building an altar to himself, one murder at a time, and it all came down to one thing: control. Dennis Rader lived for it, obsessed over it, fed on it. He needed to control everything: the crime scene, the victim, the police, the media, the narrative. And in his mind, if he had control, he had power. And if he had power, he was divine. The stories he told in his letters weren't just confessions, performances. He called them presentations, each one full of structure, rhythm, titles, introductions. He named his victims like chapters in a twisted book, a key signed off like an author, and sometimes like a preacher. He quoted the Bible, invented strange theology. He said God gave him the urge. That factor X, some dark force, drove him to kill. But in truth, that was just another way to pass the blame, to feel chosen. He kept meticulous records, drawings, graphs, timelines, staged photographs, folders of projects, his sick name for the women he stalked and killed. He documented everything, every step. He wrote scripts for his murders. Scripts. He'd write the dialogue he imagined, what he would say, what they might scream, where he would stand, what he would wear. He even assigned roles like a stage play, and when it was over, he would come home, file it away in a locked cabinet, sleep like nothing happened. This wasn't rage, this wasn't passion. This was devotion. He treated his killings like ceremonies. Sometimes, after a murder, he would pose the bodies, dress them in clothing he brought with him, photograph them, stage the room, not for shock, but for symbolism. For a man who lived a dull, average life, mowing his lawn, sitting in church pews, selling alarms door to door, the crime scene was the only place he felt real. It was where he could drop the PS, mask dot, where he became BTK, where he could pretend he was more than a father, more than a nobody in those moments. He believed he was immortal, but it wasn't enough to kill. He needed credit, and when the papers failed to give it to him after the Otero murders, he learned an important lesson. He would have to write his own legend. So that's what he did. Letter after letter, each one bolder, more detailed, more theatrical. He mailed letters to the media, to the police, even left clues at crime scenes, a kind of breadcrumb trail for those smart enough to follow. He wrote poems, drawings, maps, and coded messages. It was like he was building his own religion, and he was the god at the center. At one point, he tried to name himself like a villain in a comic book. BTK was his brand, but he wanted something more memorable. He brainstormed names in his letters. The Garrote Phantom, the Wichita Strangler, the Asphyxiator. None of them stuck, so he went back to the one that chilled people the most. BTK. It was simple, direct, and terrifying, because it wasn't just a name. It was a set of instructions. Bind, torture, kill. Dennis loved rules, structure. He had his own twisted moral code. He claimed he didn't kill children, that he selected only certain types, that his victims were chosen through long stalking rituals. He believed he was sparing others, but the truth was simpler. He didn't care about morals. He cared about control, and when control slipped, he punished. In 1977, he stalked and murdered Shirley Vianne, a mother of 3. Her children were in the house during the attack. He locked them in the bathroom before killing their mother in the bedroom. Afterward, he walked out calmly, left them crying behind a door. He didn't see children, he saw witnesses. And witnesses, for now, were too risky. But even that mercy was calculated and chilling. Later that year, he murdered Nancy Fox. That time, he called 911 himself. Cool and calm, gave the address, said a body was there, hung up, and walked away. Then he mailed a poem about it to the newspaper. Yes, a poem. He called it, "Oh, Death to Nancy," a grotesque little rhyme about what he'd done. Who does that? Someone who thinks they're untouchable. Someone who sees murder not as crime, but as art. He even left souvenirs, panties, jewelry, IDs, driver's licenses, kept in locked drawers, sometimes even worn during his private rituals. In one hidden collection, he kept self-portraits, photos of himself dressed as his victims, tied up, gagged, in shallow graves. In bondage, he would photograph himself using a tripod and timer, pose like a corpse, sometimes wearing a mask, other times just his own blank face. It was grotesque, bizarre, but telling. He didn't just kill them. He wanted to be them. Why? Because Dennis Rader didn't see human beings. He saw roles, and sometimes he liked to play every part. The hunter, the victim, the detective, the journalist, the judge, and, most of all, the god. Years passed. Wichita lived in fear, and every so often a new horror. 1974. Otero's 1974. Catherine Bright, 1977. Shirley Vianne, 1977. Nancy Fox, 1985. Maureen Hedge, 1986. Vicky Wegerau, 1991. Dolores Davis, 7. Confirmed victims by 1991. But the police had nothing. No DNA, no fingerprints, no suspect. He was a phantom, a name, a nightmare. No one had ever seen him. He left no trail, and then he vanished. For over a decade, Dennis Rader went silent. No murders, no letters, no notes. It was like he'd evaporated, and the city exhaled. Slowly, people moved on. The task force was reduced. The headlines faded, but BTK was still there, still watching, still waiting, still pretending to be a normal man. By the late 1990s, Dennis had a good job working for the city as a compliance officer. He wrote up people for their grass being too long. He measured pet leash lengths, gave warnings for unpainted sheds, the perfect role for a man obsessed with control. He joined the local church council, helped plan picnics, attended weekly services. He was elected president of the church congregation. He shook hands, said prayers, sang hymns, and all the while kept his mask perfectly in place. No one suspected a thing, but beneath the routine, he was bored. His children were grown. His job was easy. No one feared him anymore. He'd become invisible again. and that he couldn't stand. So in 2004, 30 years after his first murder, he reappeared out of nowhere. BTK was back. He mailed a letter to the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a photocopy of Vicky, a girl's driver's license, a woman murdered in 1986. It had never been found. Only the killer could have it. And just like that, the monster returned. The city went into lockdown. Was he back? Was he going to kill again? Had he ever left? Detectives scrambled to reopen the files. The FBI got involved. A new task force formed. In BTK. He watched, grinning. He started sending more packages to TV stations, libraries, churches, private homes, each one full of riddles, maps, photos, ciphers. He even created BTK trading cards, each one listing a victim and crime scene. He signed them with his twisted symbol, AB, AT, and a K, merged into one graphic. It was like a brand, a stamp, a mark of ownership. He was making himself mythology in one package. He included a Barbie doll, wrapped in plastic, tied up with ropes. It was dressed like one of his victims. Had makeup smeared on the face, positioned in a mock crime scene. Sick. But, so Dennis, and for a while, it worked. The public was terrified again. The media obsessed. The police overwhelmed. He was everywhere, just like old times. But Dennis had gotten too confident, too theatrical. He'd gone from predator to performer, and performers leave clues. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the beginning of the end, how a floppy disk, yes, a floppy disk cracked open 30 years of secrets, and how Dennis Rader, self-proclaimed God, caught by something as stupid as metadata. In 1979, BTK disappeared. No letters, no phone calls, no murders, nothing for a man who had once seemed desperate for attention. Dennis Rader just vanished, and for a city already living in fear, that silence was worse than the noise, because it didn't feel like closure. It didn't feel like an end. It felt like someone holding their breath, like something was waiting. The 1980s were supposed to be a fresh start for Wichita. People had grown tired of looking over their shoulders, of jumping at every knock at the door, of staring at newspaper headlines, searching for that familiar, chilling set of letters. BTK. But as the years passed with no new updates, the fear didn't fade. It just changed. It became quiet, internal. People still double-locked their doors, still looked out the peephole, still whispered at dinner parties about whether he was really gone. Was he dead? In prison? Out of state? Or had he simply gone back to being what he was before? Invisible. The police never stopped looking, but the problem was, they were looking for a ghost. The BTK letters had been filled with clues, cryptic references, inside jokes, names, but none of them ever led anywhere solid. He changed his patterns constantly. He'd wait years between kills, and now, with the silence, detectives were left in a vacuum. No new cases, no updates, just cold files and fading fingerprints. Dennis Rader, meanwhile, was thriving, because the truth was, BTK didn't go away. He just evolved. In 1985, after nearly 8 years of silence, he killed again. Her name was Maureen Hedge. She was a 53-year-old neighbor, just a few houses down from Dennis himself. She had no idea the man who waved to her on her morning walks had been watching her for weeks, that he had picked her, planned her, filed her away as Project Cookie. One rainy night, Dennis broke in and waited. He had a key. He knew her schedule, knew where she kept the phone, knew she'd come home alone. And when she did, he strangled her with his bare hands. Then, in a twisted break from his pattern, he didn't leave her there. He wrapped her in a blanket, carried her to his car, and took her body home. That's right, he brought her back to his own house, while his wife and children were out of town on a church retreat. Dennis Rader laid Maureen Hedges' body out in his basement. He posed her, photographed her, talked to her, then drove her back out to the countryside and dumped her in a ditch, like she was trash, like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. Dennis knew that. To him, she was a masterpiece. The fact that she had lived just a few doors away only made it better. He had taken someone from his own neighborhood, and no one suspected a thing. You'd think something like that would have sparked another letter, another taunt, another boast. But it DN single quotes, T. Dennis Rader kept his mouth shut, and the police, not knowing it was BTK, never connected the dots. They thought it was a random homicide, which, to Dennis, was almost better. He didn't need the fame. Not yet. He just needed the control. 3 years later, he struck again. Vicky Wegerell, 28 years old, a mother, a musician, a beloved neighbor. Dennis tricked his way into her home by pretending to be a telephone repairman. He wore a hard hat, a name tag, had a clipboard in hand. No one questioned it, not in the 80s. Once inside, he pulled a gun, forced her to the bedroom, tied her up. But Vicky fought hard. She scratched him, kicked him, tried to run. But Dennis overpowered her, strangled her, then calmly took photos of her body. He wiped the scene, left no prints, and vanished again. The police had nothing to go on. Another random break-in gone bad. But Dennis kept the photos, filed them away, labeled the folder, added it to his collection, and went back to work the next day. At his job at a DT, no one noticed anything different. He smiled, drank coffee, filed reports. At home, he was still the same father and husband, still taught Sunday school, still helped organize community barbecues. The man was a mask, and underneath, something unrecognizable. By the time he killed again in 1991, a woman named Dolores Davis. 62 years old, Dennis had mastered every step of the process. He broke in, waited, attacked, bound her with pantyhose, tied a plastic bag around her head, then, like marine hedge, took her body with him. He dumped her under a bridge, left almost no evidence, no witnesses. And then he stopped 10 years past, an entire decade with no murders, no letters, nothing. BTK faded into urban legend. Wichita moved on. The 90s came and went. Technology changed. DNA testing improved. Computers replaced typewriters. But Dennis Rader didn't budge. He stayed quiet. Let the world forget him. Let them believe he was dead or long gone. But in reality, he was still there, still watching, still filing away new projects in his mind, still waiting for the right moment. During that decade, Dennis built his perfect life. He became a compliance officer in Park City, the kind of man who wrote people up for tall grass or too many pets. He relished the power. He once measured a neighbor's lawn with a ruler and fined her. He chased stray dogs with tranquilizers. He was a tyrant with a badge, and he loved it. It scratched the same itch: control, power, fear, and all of it was legal at home. He was even more admired. He helped lead his church council, planned fundraisers, was a Cub Scout leader for years, even took his son on camping trips just months after his last known murder. No one suspected him, ever. He was boring, predictable, ordinary. But that's what made him dangerous. Because underneath the tucked-in shirt and plastic smile, the fantasies never stopped. The letters never truly ended. He just stopped mailing them. But he still wrote, still posed, still made notes. He was aging. Yes, getting slower, grayer. But inside, BTK was thriving. He had simply gone into hibernation until one day someone mentioned his name again. A journalist at the Wichita Eagle published a piece in 2004, the 30-year anniversary of the Otero murders, and asked one chilling question: whatever happened to BTK? Just like that, the beast woke up. 30 years. That's how long it had been since Dennis Rader first stepped into the Otero family's home. 30 years since he tied them up, whispered his sick rituals, and left behind a house filled with death. Wichita had moved on. The city was different now. Faster, busier, more modern. People had stopped talking about BTK, stopped fearing that every creak in the night meant he had returned. The legend had cooled. The story had become folklore, a name whispered by the older generation to scare their kids. You know, there was a killer once who tied his victims up, took pictures of them, and he was never caught. But on March 17, 2004, BTK returned. Just like that, it started the way it always had, with a letter. This time, it was sent to the Wichita Eagle, the city's newspaper, a small, plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, cold, mechanical. It referenced a murder, Vicky Wegerell, the woman killed back in 1986, a case that had gone cold. The letter claimed responsibility, and it included something else, photos, pictures of Vicky's body on the floor, strangled, bound out, and then a copy of her driver's license, something that had never been released to the public. Only the killer could have had it. The newsroom fell into chaos. Editors called the police. Police called detectives. Detectives dug up the old case files, hoping it was some elaborate hoax. But at WASN, single quotes, to everything matched. The angles, the objects in the room. Kana, even the typed language in the letter. Cold, clinical, arrogant, was a dead match for the old BTK letters from the 70s. I did it again, the letter said. After all these years, the monster had never left. He'd just gone dormant. Now, he was awake, and worse, he wanted attention. Over the next 11 months, K launched a full-blown campaign. It wasn't just one letter, it was a deluge. He sent packages to news stations, stuffed manila envelopes with doll parts, arms bound behind their backs with tiny ropes, maps, word puzzles, poems. He mailed old Polaroids, trophies from his victims, typed manifestos with titles like The BTK Story, A Serial Killer is Born. Some were hidden in public libraries, others dropped in the middle of a park, left in cereal boxes. Every time the police released a statement, BTK responded. He was listening, watching, laughing. He signed the letters the same way he always had. BTK, bind, torture, kill. He used fake names, joked about the media, referred to himself in the third person. One letter even included a list of what he called hit projects. These were people he'd watched, stalked, photographed. Most had never been harmed, but he kept notes, kept files. He wrote it like a business plan. Detectives were panicking. The killer they'd hunted for 3 decades was alive and taunting them again. But this time, stakes were higher because BTK wasn't just active, he was escalating. He had waited decades to be remembered, and now he wanted legacy. He wanted his story in print, his name in books, his work to be studied. He began referring to his letters as chapters. He had names for each victim, photos, sketches, maps. This wasn't just a killer anymore, it was a man who saw himself as an author of horror. In one letter, BTK wrote, "I'm a complex man. I have many interests. The dark side of life fascinates me." He hinted that he might kill again, teased that time was running out. But strangely, he never did. Not this time. He was older now, slower, not as capable. So instead, he shifted focus. He wanted to be famous. He wanted his name back in lights. But most of all, he wanted to be admired, not just feared. At this point, the FBI was involved. So was the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Thousands of tips poured in. Criminologists reviewed every old case file. Linguistic analysts dissected the letters line by line. Still, no name, no face, no fingerprints, just taunts from a ghost. But ghosts make mistakes, and this one was getting cocky. In early 2005, BTK sent another package, this time to a local news station. Inside was a puzzle, but not a normal one. It was a floppy disk, a 3.5-inch purple disk. It's a kind nobody really used anymore. The note with it asked, "Can this be traced?" Be honest, a key was testing them in the Wichita Police Department, desperate to catch him. They put out a public statement saying, "The disk is untraceable." BTK believed them. He mailed it. It was the beginning of the end. The disk was immediately sent to a digital forensics lab, and within minutes, they found metadata embedded in the document. It had been last edited by someone named Dennis, and the computer's metadata showed it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church. Detectives went to the church website. They looked through staff, and there it was. Dennis Rader, president of the church council. Within days, investigators were watching his home, unmarked cars, surveillance vans. They followed him to work, to the grocery store, to the library. They got a search warrant for his daughter's medical records and collected a DNA sample from her pap smear at the hospital. The sample was tested against the DNA from the BTK crime scenes. It was a familial match. The killer was her father. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over by police while driving home for lunch. He thought it was a routine stop, but then they asked him to step out of the vehicle, and he saw the guns, the badges, the looks on their faces. One of the detectives leaned in close and said, "Do you know why you're being arrested, Dennis?" And Dennis.com, as ever, replied, "I think I do." After 31 years, the monster had a name, and it was a name no one expected. Dennis Rader, the quiet city compliance officer, the Boy Scout dad, the church leader, the neighbor who lent you a ladder. He was BTK, and the world was stunned. When Dennis Rader sat down in the small, beige interrogation room at the Wichita Police Department on February 25, 2005, he looked like the kind of man who might argue with you about law and ordinances, not someone who had strangled 10 people with rope and nylons. He wore glasses, khakis, a quiet, suburban politeness, and for a moment, just a moment, some detectives wondered if they had the wrong guy. But then he opened his mouth. "I guess you got me," he said with a dry chuckle. "I was planning another project. I guess it's good you stopped me." I asked what he meant. He shrugged. "I was trolling again, getting back into my stride." And just like that, Dennis Rader, the man who had taunted police for decades, began to talk. No hesitation, no panic, no regret, just talking, like he'd been waiting years for someone to listen. They turned on the tape recorder, and what followed was over 30 hours of pure horror. Not screaming, not crying, but calculated, clean, cold descriptions of torture, death, and control. To the detectives, it was like watching a man unspool a decades-old horror film, one he had directed, written, and starred in. Except this one was real. Rader began by correcting them. He didn't call them murders. He called them projects. Each victim had a code name in his head. He talked about them like unfinished business contracts. There was Project Little Mex, he said, referring to Manuela Martinez, a woman he stalked but never attacked. Project Lights Out, a failed attempt on another neighbor. Project Cookie, an older woman who'd unknowingly walked away from death after he lost his nerve. But some he finished, and those he remembered in detail. Too much detail. "Let's start with the Oteros," he said. As casually as someone might order lunch, he described parking a few blocks away, how he walked through the backyard, cut the phone lines. He remembered the exact moment he entered their house, that one of the kids was eating cereal. He described tying up 38-year-old Joseph Terrell, first Dot, then Julie, then the kids. The boy, He was kinda brave. He said about 9-year-old Joseph Jr., but I had to take care of him. Strangled him with a plastic bag. He mentioned how it took longer than he expected, how he was nervous but excited, how he had fantasies about it all going back to childhood, and then, as if reliving a fond memory, he smiled and said, "It was a good hit." They asked how he chose victims. He said it was a 3-step process: trolling, driving around, walking neighborhoods, looking for women who fit his fantasy, stalking, following them, watching routines, taking notes, planning, drawing maps, setting dates, prepping kill kits. He carried hit kits in his car: ropes, tape, knives, plastic bags, gloves, change of clothes, a fake ID. He would leave notes on his dashboard so it looked like he was running errands. He was always prepared. He told them about Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3. She was sick that day, he said. Had the flu, I think. Tied her up in her son's bedroom while the kids were locked in the bathroom. He remembered the layout. What books were on the shelf, the pattern on the carpet. He remembered everything. They asked about Nancy Fox, a woman he murdered in her home in 1977. He smiled. That one was special, he said. He had watched her for weeks, planned it down to the minute. He waited for her to come home, cut the phone lines, entered through the back. He told her he was going to tie her up and do things to her. She begged. He killed her anyway then. In this part, chilled detectives. He called 911 himself the next day. Yes, you'll find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, he told the operator, Nancy Fox. Then he hung up. Detectives asked why he stopped for so long. From the late 80s to the early 2000s, his answer: family, kids, church stuff. Got too busy. Too busy to kill. Like he was talking about a hobby he dropped. He went on to say he'd written letters during that time, journals, fantasy stories where he imagined killings. Sometimes he'd drive around with his hit kit in the trunk, hoping to get inspired, but he never acted on it. Not until he got the itch again in 2004. The detectives noticed something strange during the interviews. Rader wasn't proud. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even disturbed. He was organized. He talked like a manager reviewing quarterly performance. He corrected details, drew diagrams. At one point, reached for a pen and sketched out knot diagrams, his preferred binding techniques. He referred to some as reverse wraps, others as over-under restraints. It wasn't just about killing. It was about control, power, the fantasy of holding someone's life in his hands. They asked about the letters, why he sent them, why he came back after all those years. He grinned. I missed the game, he said. It was fun again. He told them he enjoyed seeing the news, scrambled-eyed, reading the headlines, watching the panic build in Wichita again. He even subscribed to the paper to collect the clippings. He called them his portfolio. But nothing shocked detectives more than what he said next. He had started preparing for his final masterpiece, a last hit. He called it Project X. It was a woman he'd been watching for months. He had a full folder on her maps, his photos, routines. He even had a costume picked out, a fake uniform to gain access to her home. He planned to kill her, take photos, write one last letter, then disappear forever. That would have been my curtain call, he said. But he never got the chance. Dennis Rader confessed to 10 murders in all. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't deny anything. He wanted to talk. He was proud in his eyes. This was his final audience, and now someone was listening. The recordings of those interviews are still used today in criminal psychology classes. They show what true evil can look like, not just loud and bloody, but calm, patient, and methodical. Rader didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just smiled and told the world who he really was. The courtroom was packed. Media vans lined the street. Locals stood behind barricades, clutching newspapers and homemade signs, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had haunted Wichita for over 30 years. Inside, the air was tight, heavy, with a mix of anticipation, dread, and disbelief. The man at the center of it all. He wore a tan blazer, wire-rimmed glasses, hair neatly combed. He carried a yellow legal pad and sat with a straight back, nodding respectfully to the bailiff. Dennis Rader, known to the world now as the BTK Killer, looked more like a middle school principal than one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. But that was the thing about Rader. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader stood before a Kansas judge and did something no one quite expected. He pled guilty, not just quietly, not just on paper, but out loud for the entire courtroom and the world to hear. What followed was a 45-minute horror story read in the calm, collected voice of a man describing a boring Monday at work. And it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a performance. "Your Honor," Rader began, "I have some notes here I'd like to go through. I hope that's acceptable." The judge nodded. Rader flipped open his yellow legal pad, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. One by one, he named his victims. One by one, he described how he killed them. And the more he talked, the harder it became to breathe in the room. He started with the Otero family. January 15th, 1974. I had what I call projects. They were pre-selected. I would watch them. I broke into their home. I tied them up. I had a kill kit. I strangled Mr. Otero first. Then Mrs. Otero. The children were last. He said it like he was checking off a grocery list. The judge, stunned, had to stop him several times to clarify. "Mr. Rader," the judge asked, "how did you kill them?" "Strangulation," Rader replied. "I used cords, belts, plastic bags, whatever was available." He moved to Catherine Bright in April 1974. He explained how he broke in, waited, and was surprised when she arrived with her brother, Kevin. "Things got out of control," he said. "I shot the brother. He got away. I stabbed and strangled her. That wasn't my original plan. It got messy." Then he calmly flipped to the next page. He recounted the murder of Shirley Vian. "I talked to her. She had kids. I put the kids in the bathroom, tied her up in the bedroom. I told her I was doing this as part of a sexual fantasy. Then I strangled her with a rope." Okay. A man in the gallery began to sob. Rader didn't look up. He described Nancy Fox in 1977. "I broke in, waited. When she got home, I told her what I was going to do. She argued a little. I tied her up, took off her clothes. Then I strangled her with a belt. Afterwards, I called 911. The judge paused again. "Why did you call 911? Rader looked up, confused by the question. "Because I wanted her found. It was part of the plan." He confessed to murdering Maureen Hedge in 1985. This time, the story was worse, because he didn't just break in. He planned it during a Cub Scout campout where he was chaperoning kids. "I told the boys I had a headache, left in the middle of the night, took my kill kit, broke into her house, waited until she got home. I strangled her, took her body to a church basement and posed her, took pictures, cleaned up, went back to the campout." No one could believe what they were hearing. A father, a church council member, a Cub Scout leader, sneaking away from a Boy Scout event. To kill. Then came Vicky Wegerell, 1986. He tricked her by posing as a telephone repairman. She led him inside. "We fought," he said, annoyed. "She scratched me. I finally got control. Strangled her, took a few photos, left." D. explained how he went back to work afterward, like nothing happened. Then, his final known murder, Dolores Davis. In 1991, I parked down the road, walked to her house, broke in through the back door, waited, tied her up, took her out to a remote area, left her body under a bridge, came back later to move it again, buried some items. He ended the confession with a sentence that made everyone freeze. That's all 10. That's the 10 I'm aware of. The 10 I'm aware of. Throughout the entire confession, Rader never cried, never hesitated, never apologized. He showed more emotion when talking about his childhood than his victims. In fact, corrected the prosecutor's grammar during his plea hearing. He didn't just admit to the murders, he owned them, relived them almost, enjoyed the attention. People who watched that trial, in person or on TV, often describe it the same way. It felt like he was giving a PowerPoint on hell. One juror later said, it felt like watching a man catalog trophies. And, in a way, he was. Rader had kept trophies from nearly every victim: jewelry, underwear, ID cards. He'd even taken Polaroids of some bodies, posed after death. He called these his moments, and he stored them in manila folders labeled with fake names, like a filing cabinet of nightmares. After the confession, the courtroom was dead silent. Then, one by one, the victims' families spoke. They didn't yell, they didn't curse. They told Rader who he really was: a coward, a fraud, a demon hiding in khakis. One woman said, "I hope every time you blink, you see her face." Another, "You stole her from this world, but we will not speak your name again." Then the judge delivered his sentence: 10 consecutive life terms, no parole, no appeal, no daylight. He would die in prison alone. But even as the judge sentenced him, Rader just stood there, nodding politely, like he was receiving a parking ticket. He was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility. He was placed in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, and to this day, he still claims he has reformed. He reads the Bible, writes letters, draws disturbing sketches, and still, sometimes, signs things with his old initials, BTK. The trial of Dennis Rader wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a window into evil, the kind that doesn't growl or scream, the kind that sits beside you in church, that waves from the front yard, that watches, waits, and strikes. There's a reason why people say you never truly know your neighbors. By all accounts, Dennis Rader's home on Independence Street in Park City, Kansas, was normal. The lawn was mowed. Green trash bin sat neatly on the curb. He waved at people, kept a tight routine. His wife, Paula, ran the household. Their 2 kids had grown up their birthdays, holidays, backyard barbecues. It was the picture of a quiet, middle-class life. But what police found inside was a mausoleum of secrets. When authorities arrested Rader in February 2005, they didn't just seize his body. They seized his past, and his house became a crime scene, not for one murder, but 10. The search began that same evening while Rader was being interrogated downtown. Detectives moved in with flashlights and gloves. They didn't know exactly what they were looking for, but they were told by the FBI to expect souvenirs. What they found would leave even seasoned officers shaken. Rader had a home office just off the living room. It was clean, too clean. Books stacked evenly, computer on the desk, filing cabinet locked, but the desk drawers, that's where the first tremors began. Inside one drawer were maps, city blocks, aerial views, specific homes circled in red ink. Some circled addresses were familiar, victim homes. Others were complete mysteries. There were handwritten notes tucked in legal folders, labeled with names that weren't real: Project Green, Project Cookie, Project Little Mex. Each folder contained details: surveillance, log schedules when she left the house, what time her husband returned, where she worked, what dog she owned, which was like a predator's hunting journal. Some entries were 30 years old, and here they were, printed in fading ink, filed alphabetically. But it got worse. Underneath those folders, tucked under a false bottom panel, Police found photographs, dozens of them, victims, post-mortem, bound, posed, lifeless. Others were of Rader himself, wearing a mask, wearing women's underwear, tied up in rope, suspended in strange positions. Late in shallow graves he had dug for himself. He'd set up a tripod and used a timer. Sometimes he wore a wig, sometimes a woman's mask made of latex. In one photo, he was buried in leaves with only his head sticking out. In another, he posed in a grave with a plastic bag over his head, reenacting one of his own murders. He called this self-bondage, but it was more than that. It was ritual. Asterisk, behind the furnace, in the basement, they found a tiny door, like something a child might crawl through. It was locked from the inside. They had to remove part of the wall to get in. Inside, kill kit, not just one, several plastic tubs, each labeled with duct tape. Kit number 4, kit number 7, final kit. Each one contained nylon rope tape, plastic bags, gloves, pantyhose, pre-cut bindings, Polaroid camera, a change of clothes, even a small flashlights and screwdrivers. Some kits had women's underwear trophies from victims, sealed in Ziploc bags. Others had hand-drawn diagrams. One was a crude sketch of a woman tied to a chair, with X's over her eyes. At the bottom, he had written, Phase 2, Afternoon Fun, Location, TBD. It wasn't fantasy, it was a blueprint. Asterisk Rader loved to document. Police found over 20 VHS tapes in a shoebox marked Scout Events, but when they popped them into a player, there were no Cub Scouts. Instead, the tapes showed Rader in a variety of disguises, acting out scenarios. One was filmed in the shed. He dragged a mannequin across the floor, tied it to a pole, whispered into the camera, "This is what Nancy looked like." Another showed him crawling around in his own backyard, stalking a scarecrow as if it were prey. Others were worse. He filmed himself building fake coffins, practicing knots, reading the Bible with ropes laid across his lap. One tape, later called the Treehouse Video by detectives, showed Rader climbing into a neighbor's tree at night, watching their home from above, silent, still, 4 hours. Asterisk tucked in a file cabinet. Officers found notebooks, hundreds of pages, each one carefully dated. He called them his dark chronicles. He wrote about his victims, how they begged, how they cried, how they almost got away. He recounted how he stalked them, wrote about the smell of their homes. One entry read, "She had pink shampoo. Very sweet. That was the last thing she ever used. I liked that." Another, Project Cookie. "She wore yellow pajamas. That's when I knew it was the right night. Her TV was too loud. That annoyed me." Rader used code words, trolling, his term for cruising around looking for new victims. PJ, short for Project, his internal name for each kill hit night. The evening he would strike, "Oh Death," K, name he gave to the spirit that demanded. He killed. He often ended entries with a prayer, "Forgive me, Lord, for what I am about to do." Asterisk here. Officers found a hidden crawlspace behind the water heater. Inside, more bags, vacuum, sealed. Some held lingerie, not his wife's. Others held driver's licenses, library cards, or locks of hair. One bag had a child's hair clip, pink, bent slightly at the metal dot. Another held a woman's watch, still ticking. Detectives had to photograph each item, then begin the gut-wrenching task of connecting them to cold case files. Asterisk, Rader's desktop PC, old but functional, held more of the same. A folder titled BTK Life, dozens of text files, with victim logs, fantasy stories he wrote, graphic, violent, disturbingly detailed. A draft for a book he planned to publish. BTK, the story of me. He even made PowerPoint slides. One titled, How to Tie Properly, included photos and instructions. Another slide read, Why I am superior to Jack the Ripper in his email drafts. He had unsent letters to media outlets. He had reached out to a publisher. He was planning a memoir. Asterisk officers also found copies of the letters he sent to the media and police over the years. But most haunting of all, they found new ones. UNSENT, written recently. To whom? Future victims. One letter began, "Dear Nancy, 2. I have watched you for a while now. Your kitchen window at 7:45 p.m. is too inviting. Your cat sees me. I wonder if you will." Another letter was written to his daughter, but never sent. "Someday, you may know who I really am. I hope you forgive me. I kept most of the darkness away from you. I kept it neat, kept it buried, asterisk, in the attic, tucked behind insulation." Detectives found a full-length mirror mounted horizontally on the floor. Beside it was a tripod and a box of wigs. This is where he had practiced poses, not for vanity, for death. He would dress in stolen women's clothing, wrap himself in ropes, take photos from above, looking down on himself like a crime scene investigator. Asterisk. Everything inside the house pointed to one thing. Dennis Rader lived 2 full lives in one life. He was a father, a church president, a Cub Scout leader, a compliance officer who measured lawns and gave out parking citations, a man who grilled burgers and helped elderly neighbors carry groceries in. The other life. He was a stalker, a killer, a narcissist, a man who treated murder like a private religion, a man who believed God understood his urges. One detective later said, "This wasn't just the home of a killer. It was the cathedral of a serial killer's mind." Hay kept his trophies like a priest keeps relics, with reverence. The photos, the notes, the folders, the kits, the letters, the self-dash portraits. It was all ritual. The search of Dennis Rader's house didn't just provide evidence. It gave insight into how evil can live undetected, how a man can mow his lawn on Saturday and plan a murder that same night. This was no spontaneous spree, no outburst, no one-time mistake. This was disciplined horror. 30 years of secrets, hidden in plain sight, locked in cabinets, buried in crawlspaces, smiling across the picket fence. Asterisk. After Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, he was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, a maximum security prison with concrete walls, razor wire fences, and over 1,500 inmates. But even there, even in a place built to erase people from society, Dennis Rader made himself known, because the man who once begged to be anonymous, the man who vanished for 25 years after taunting police, suddenly wanted to talk and write and draw and reach out. From behind bars, BTK was born again, not in God, but in infamy, and he loved it. Asterisk. It began with a trickle. A few reporters wrote to him, unsure if he'd respond. He did, in perfect block handwriting. Dennis Rader answered every letter with meticulous care. He addressed envelopes as IF, filing legal documents. He corrected grammar. He even made edits to newspaper articles about himself, circling incorrect facts and writing wrong in the margins, followed by his own version of events. He sent these back unsolicited. He wanted the record straight, not for the sake of truth, but because he saw himself as the historian of his own legend. In his mind, BTK was misunderstood. He wasn't a monster. He was a misunderstood genius, a misunderstood artist. So he began writing. Asterisk. Rader titled his manuscript, The BTK Story. Fact, not fiction. My untold story. It was over 200 pages long, handwritten, divided into chapters. Each chapter had a dramatic title: The Birth of BTK, Project Foxhunt, Confessions of the Midnight Stalker, My Final Act, Act 10, The God Factor, My Talk with the Almighty. He wrote about everything: his childhood, how he killed animals in secret, how he experimented with autoerotic asphyxiation at age 13, how he created death fantasies involving neighborhood women and buried them in his mind for decades. He wrote about each murder in disturbing detail, sometimes in the third person, sometimes in the first, as if reliving it. He even assigned chapters to his own phases of murder. Each victim had a code name. Each plan was its own episode. Each hit night was described like an actor taking stage. I, dressed in the dark, laid out the kit, checked my script, reviewed the entry plan. At 10:43 p.m., I became BTK. The manuscript includes sketches, crude but haunting, stick figures in ropes, floor plans of victim homes, a flowchart titled The BTK Life Cycle. Troll gives plan, gives kill, gives retreat, gives relive. One page simply reads, The 7 Commandments of BTK. No witnesses, always have a backup plan. Keep trophies, respect the fantasy, don't rush our troll with patience. Return to the scene, if possible, to relive. Asterisk. Then came the drawings. Rader began to send people sketches he made in his cell. He signed them BTK or D, or some were abstract, others shockingly graphic. He sent one to a true crime collector, a drawing of himself in a noose, hanging over a grave that read, BTK's Hell. Another was a sketch of a bound woman with devil horns and the word Project X scrawled across her chest. He began drawing murder scenes from memory, and labeling them like blueprints. Entry point, unlocked backdoor rope. Length, 6.3 feet. Body position, a death pose, phase 2. Some drawings were almost childlike stick figures with smiles, surrounded by crosses and chains. Others were religious, a crucifix made of rope, an angel crying blood, Jesus kneeling at a BTK shrine. Asterisk. What psychologists have noted about Dennis Rader is chilling. He didn't evolve. He didn't move past his crimes. He lives in them mentally, spiritually. From prison, he continues to chronicle, categorize, and ritualize the murders, as if still adding footnotes to an unfinished novel. He once told a journalist, I'm still BTK. I just don't act on it anymore. I relive it though. That's enough. He said this without emotion, as if discussing traffic patterns or weather reports. Asterisk. Even worse. Rader received fan mail. Women wrote to him. Some flirted. Some claimed to understand him. Some wanted signed drawings. Some called him misunderstood. Rader replied to many. He thanked them, sent them birthday cards, described his daily routines, explained his philosophy of control. He asked questions. What color are your eyes? Do you believe in fate? Have you ever tied yourself up just to see how it feels? Prison staff intercepted many of these. Some letters were sexual in nature. Others were chillingly cold. He once wrote, I think of binding as a form of art, of giving shape to chaos. When a body is still, it's beautiful. Asterisk. Rader also kept writing to police, psychologists, and criminologists. He offered to help with other cold cases, not to solve them, but to insert himself into the process. He critiqued other killers. Gacy was messy, too obvious. Bundy lacked control. Dahmer was a product of his environment. But I planned. Abana followed rules. I was surgical. He claimed his killings were messages. He once sent a letter to the Wichita Police Department, post-conviction, titled Reflections of a Ghost. It contained a diagram of his 10 murders. X's marked the homes. A timeline ran along the bottom. At the top, he had written, BTK walked here. He still walks here. Just can't see him anymore. Asterisk. Perhaps most disturbing of all was his apology letter to his daughter, Carrie Rawson. She didn't ask for it, but he wrote it anyway. It read more like a warped sermon than a confession. I hope you see I tried to shield you from the dark. Why I was so strict. Rules are control. Control is good. K needed control. Your father tried to separate that part of him from you. He included a drawing of a fence. On one side was family. On the other side, BTK. In the middle, a gate labeled sign. He ended the letter. I was two people. You only knew the father. The monster lived in silence. Can you still love one half of me? Carrie never responded. She wrote a book, instead, about surviving the horror of learning her dad was BTK. Asterisk, eventually, the Kansas Department of Corrections limited Rader's correspondence. He wasn't allowed to send out drawings anymore. All letters were screened. He could only communicate with approved contacts. But that didn't stop him from writing. He simply stored them in his cell. Pages and pages of journals, drawings, timelines, schematics, a BTK archive still growing today. Guards say his cell is obsessively clean. He folds each towel the same way. His food trays are arranged with geometric precision. He writes from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. daily. He calls it my time with the dark. Asterisks, criminal psychologists say Rader's post-arrest writings reveal a narcissist with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, delusions of grandeur, and paraphilic disorders. But more than that, they reveal a man who never left the scene of the crime. He may be physically imprisoned, but mentally, he's still crawling through yards, still drawing maps, still reliving the bind, torture, kill cycle over and over again. Like a prayer, he can't stop reciting. Asterisk one FBI profiler put it this way: some killers die when they're caught. Dennis Rader just moved his ritual to paper. Dennis Rader's letters from prison aren't just disturbing. They're living proof that the BTK killer still exists, locked away, but very much alive in spirit. His words drip with ego. His drawings echo the past. His confessions are not apologies. They are celebrations of control, dominance, and his own myth. Even now, years after his final act, BTK continues to write his legacy. But the final word doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the victims, the survivors, and the families who refuse to let his letters define the story. Rader's fantasy may have endured in prison, but outside, his name is remembered not for brilliance, but for the banality of evil wrapped in suburbia. Asterisk. They called them projects. That was Dennis Rader's word for them. Cold, mechanical, like assignments in a twisted course syllabus. For every 10 people he stalked, he may have only acted on one, but the others, the ones who slipped away because a door was locked, a dog barked, or the timing wasn't quite right. They never knew how close they came. They were the ghosts that never got written into the final pages of BTK's story, and yet they were integral to his cycle. They fed him, They taught him patience. They made him feel like God, like he could take a life or spare it, simply because he decided to walk away. These failed projects weren't failures to Rader. They were dry runs, test flights, ritual rehearsals, and even decades later, behind bars, he remembered them all by name, by face, by street. When police searched his home, they didn't just find photos of victims. They found folders, manila envelopes labeled with initials or nicknames, filled with maps, sketches, notes, and typed profiles. He had built files on people he never touched, never even approached. And those files told a story just as horrifying as the crimes themselves. Take Project Green. That's what he called one of his earliest fixations. A young woman who lived just a few blocks from his childhood home in Wichita. She worked nights at a local diner. Dennis saw her every Thursday when he was in his 20s. He would watch from the parking lot, pretending to read a newspaper, making mental notes about her closing routine. She wore a pink jacket. She always locked the back door first. She kept a small revolver in her purse. It's that last detail he discovered, that during one of his trolling runs, when he peeked through her bedroom window and saw her practicing with it in the mirror. That was enough to scrap the plan. But the folder remained, complete with a hand-drawn map, a list of imagined entry points, and a disturbing checklist labeled ritual options. Then there was Project Light's Elt, a married mother of two who lived on the edge of town near a field. Rader stalked her for weeks in the fall of 1978. He even broke into her garage one night, hid in the crawl space above the ceiling, and waited, only to realize, after hours, she had gone out of town unexpectedly. He left before dawn, taking only a pair of underwear from the laundry basket. It was his consolation prize, a placeholder. Years later, he wrote about the incident in his journal as a missed communion. He said he dreamed of going back, but never did. She never knew he had been there, and there were others, dozens of them, victims whose only act of survival was randomness. One woman had a boyfriend show up unexpectedly. Another took a different route home and missed crossing paths with Rader by minutes. One teenage girl was targeted for months. He had tracked her routine down to the minute, but she got a dog, a German Shepherd, and that changed everything. Rader wrote in his files, "High alert, audible deterrent, project failed." Investigators would later find a list in Rader's office at his job as a compliance officer. It was disguised as an inspection report, but beneath the codes and zoning jargon were veiled notes about women, cryptic lines like front window exposure, ideal, garage, unsecured, lives alone, Thursad. When they cross-referenced those notes with the city's housing records and maps, they found addresses, real people, real names, all in walking distance from Rader's Roots home. Some were women he issued citations to for grass too high or paint peeling on a fence. It was the perfect ruse. He got close. He looked inside. He took mental inventory. One woman, who later spoke under the pseudonym Karen, remembered Rader come into her house in uniform. She said he told her shed was out of code. He looked into her kitchen while she stood on the porch, nervous. He asked if her husband was home. She said no. He smiled and said, "Well, I hope you're not alone too often. Some real creeps out there these days." Then he walked away. She said she never forgot his face, not because of fear at the time, but because it was so unremarkably polite. Ski was like a neighbor, a guy you trust with your dog. But when I saw his mugshot years later, I dropped my coffee. Then there were the aborted entries, times when Rader actually broke in, but never followed through. He called them practice kills. Once, he entered a home at midnight, planning to wait for the occupant to return. But as the hours dragged on, he grew paranoid. He heard police sirens blocks away and panicked, slipping out the back door and vanishing into the alley. He later drew the entire interior of the home from memory. He knew the pattern of the wallpaper, the location of the family photos, the distance between the bedroom and the bathroom. That house remained in his files for over a decade, labeled pending. In one of his prison writings, Rader boasted that he had at least 55 plus projects across 30 years. He described the process like a fisherman talking about catch and release. Not all of them are meant to be kept. Some are just for the thrill. The chase is a holy thing. He said that stalking was a form of worship, a way to adore his future victims from a distance. He never felt guilty about the ones he didn't kill. In fact, he saw it as a kind of benevolence. Sometimes I'll let them live, let them go, up, because of mercy, just because the scene wasn't right. One girl, just 17 at the time, had no idea she was ever targeted. She only learned about it when the FBI contacted her years later. Rader had kept a school photo of her in a folder labeled PJs, short for Project Jumpstart. He had drawn a sketch of her bedroom. When agents asked how he got it, he told them he'd watched her through the window for weeks while she did homework. She was never harmed, never approached. But she later admitted she'd had recurring nightmares as a teen about a man watching me from the woods. She thought it was just anxiety. She was right, but it wasn't in her head. These stories, the near misses, are the reason. BTK's full victim count will never be truly known. Because how do you measure psychological murder? How do you count the people he infected with fear years after he walked away? How many women changed their routines, changed addresses, got dogs, took self-defense classes, all because of a presence they couldn't name? Rader once wrote, "The power wasn't just in the act, it was in knowing I couldn't." He called it phantom dominion. He said it made him feel like a shadow, always there, spabbed. In truth, these survivors weren't just spared. They were erased from his narrative intentionally. He didn't need to kill them to make them part of his story. It became characters in the background, test dummies in his private theater of violence. And most of them will never know. Years after his arrest, when asked by a psychologist what he would have done if he hadn't been caught, Rader responded flatly, "Gone back to my files." There were still more projects. It's one of the most chilling truths in the BTK saga. His silence wasn't retirement. It was research. Behind every locked door, every flickering light, every dog bark that broke the silence, there might have been a decision made, not by fate, but by a man who watched, who waited, and who, sometimes, for reasons known only to him, simply walked away. Asterisk. Carrie Rawson was in her kitchen when the FBI knocked on her door. It was a quiet February morning in 2005. Snow still clung to the edges of the windows. Her husband, Darian, opened the door, confused at first. Agents in suits, straight faces, no smiles. One of them asked if she was Carrie, and when she stepped forward, barely out of her pajamas, the man spoke words that would end the life she thought she was living. "Your father has been arrested. His name is Dennis Rader. He's being charged as the BTK serial killer." For a moment, time fell silent. Carrie couldn't even feel the floor beneath her. Her breath left her lungs in one long, collapsing sigh. Then came the nausea. Then the cold. Then the words, "No, you're wrong. That's not possible. My dad." She wasn't just in shock. Her mind was in rebellion. Her father was a church president, an Air Force veteran, a doting dad who built snow forts with her in the winter and left notes in her lunchbox. He grilled steaks on Sundays. He'd cried when he walked her down the aisle. He was the man who taught her how to ride a bike, how to drive, how to pray. She had loved him, still did, right up until that moment. The agents handed her a stack of documents. Inside were photos of her father's arrest, a list of known BTK victims, and notes from an ongoing investigation that spanned decades. She stared at the names. Women she didn't know, lives taken before she was even born. But somehow, they were now tied to her forever, not just by proximity, but by blood. That was the day Karis's identity shattered into pieces she didn't yet know how to hold. Over the next few weeks, her world collapsed in slow, quiet horror. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside. Her mother, Paula, fell into a stunned silence that lasted days. Carrie kept reliving every memory of her childhood, looking for signs, for shadows, for the monster hiding under the surface of her father's smile. And what terrified her most, was that she couldn't find any. Dennis Rader had been the ideal father, protective, attentive, patient. He never raised his voice. He came to every recital, every graduation, every birthday party. There were family trips to the zoo, fishing weekends, camping under the stars. He taught her how to tie knots, the same knots he used to bind his victims. She remembered years ago when she had a nightmare about someone breaking into their house. She had run to her parents' room, crying. Her dad got up, walked through every room, checked every window. He even stayed up that night, watching over her from the hallway. How'd he reconcile that man with the man who strangled children? Carrie found herself grieving a father who wasn't dead, but who no longer existed. She called it a psychological death, the loss of someone you thought you knew. The man who hugged her goodnight was now a confessed killer, a predator who stalked women for sport. And worst of all, he had smiled at her graduation, knowing what he had done. The media dubbed her BTK's daughter. She hated the phrase. It felt like being branded, like her DNA was now public property. People whispered in grocery stores. Friends stopped calling. Strangers looked at her like she was infected, as if evil was something you could inherit. In the weeks after the arrest, Carrie wrote to her father in prison, not because she forgave him, but because she needed answers. And he responded. In neat, blocky handwriting, he wrote about his crimes with a strange detachment. He apologized for embarrassing the family. He told her he loved her. He was proud of her, that he had always kept his two worlds separate. She read those words and felt her stomach twist. Two worlds, one filled with bedtime stories and birthday cards, the other filled with ropes, masks, and torture kits. And somehow, both lived inside the same man. At first, she tried to cut him off. She deleted letters, burned the envelopes. A trauma doesn't vanish with silence. It festers. She spiraled into depression, lost sleep, felt her heart race in public places. She stopped trusting herself, because how could she if she'd missed the truth about the person she trusted most? It took years before Carrie began to speak publicly, but when she did, her words weren't just brave, they were necessary. She didn't want to be defined by her father's crimes. She wanted to reclaim her story, not just for herself, but for the victims and for others who had lived in the shadow of inherited shame. She wanted the world to know that children of monsters aren't monsters themselves. They're survivors too. In 2019, she published a memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter. In it, she told the story of her family's unraveling, but also her own rebirth. She spoke about therapy, faith, the fight to believe in good again. And she gave voice to something most people never think about, the collateral damage of serial murder. Not the headlines, not the courtroom sketches, but the families. The daughters who go numb when they hear their last name. The wives who realize they kissed a killer goodbye every morning for 30 years. The children who grew up thinking their home was safe only to learn it was a mask for horror. Carrie said something once in an interview that sticks like a shard of glass. He didn't just murder 10 people. He murdered my entire reality. And I've had to rebuild it from ashes. Man, that's exactly what she's done today. Carrie Rawson is an advocate for survivors, victims, families, and people navigating trauma caused by someone else's evil. She has worked with the FBI on cold cases. She's spoken at universities. She's looked killers in the eye and said, "You didn't destroy me." But she still has moments, dark, quiet moments, when the memories come back. Her father's voice on the phone, his face on the news. A childhood photo that looks innocent now, but carries the weight of lies. Because no matter how far she runs, she will always be his daughter. Not by choice, not by belief, just by birth. But she's something else too. She's a survivor, not of his crimes, but of the life that followed them. And in telling her story, Carrie Rawson gave voice to the silent victims, the family members, the children, the people left to pick up the pieces. She turned her pain into purpose, and in doing so, she proved one haunting, powerful truth. Evil can be inherited, but so can courage. Asterisk. For over 30 years, Dennis Rader had gotten away with murder. He had taunted police, played games with the press, left sick clues inside cereal boxes filed between torture fantasies and Bible verses. But by 2004, something inside him changed. He was bored, frustrated, forgotten. His ego, swollen from decades of silence, could no longer take the anonymity. He needed to be BTK again, and that, not law enforcement, not technology, not fate, would be his downfall, because, in the end, It wasn't some fancy FBI profiler or witness who cracked the case. It wasn't fingerprints or DNA or a sudden confession. It was a floppy disk. Yes, it's that old piece of outdated tech you might not even recognize anymore. 1.44 megabytes of data. It's enough to hold a Word document and maybe a few grainy photos. And for BTK, it was enough rope to hang himself. It started in early 2004. Right after the Wichita Eagle ran a 30th anniversary story about the unsolved BTK case. The piece rehashed old details, the Otero family, the codes, the dead ends, but what it really did was poke the beast. Ken Rader, now in his 50s, couldn't resist. He sent a letter to the newspaper. The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. After all these years, he was back. And once he returned, he couldn't stop. Over the next several months, he mailed more packages, notes, photos, items from the victims' homes. He even left a cereal box in a stranger's truck in a Home Depot parking lot, a sick joke referencing one of his projects that he never completed. But the letters weren't just about gloating. They were probing, testing. Rader wanted to play again, but on his terms. In December of 2004, he asked Wichita police a strange question. It was tucked into a package like a riddle. Can I communicate with you using a floppy disk? Be honest. I need to know. Can it be traced back to me? If not, I'll send one. Put your answer in the classified ads under X. It will be okay. It sounded like a setup from a bad spy novel, but to Rader, it was deadly serious. The Wichita Police Department, working with the FBI and the local media, crafted their reply carefully. They published a coded message in the newspaper as requested. It read, Rex, it will be okay. To Rader, that was the green light, a promise. He believed them. And so, on February 16, 2005, Dennis Rader sent a purple 1.44 megabytes floppy disk to the Fox TV affiliate in Wichita. Inside the padded envelope was a gold cross necklace, a printed letter, and the disk. The letter taunted them again, filled with cryptic phrases. The disk was the real payload. He thought he had erased it, thought it was clean. He was wrong. FBI tech analysts examined the metadata from the disk. Took only minutes. The disk's Microsoft Word document had been saved under the name Dennis. The file history pointed to Christ Lutheran Church. The disk had last been edited on a computer registered to Dennis Rader. It wasn't just a smoking gun. It was a full confession wrapped in a digital bow. Authorities immediately began to connect the dots. Rader was the president of the church council at Christ Lutheran. He was also a compliance officer for Park City, known for being a stickler, someone who measured lawns and handed out warnings for broken sprinklers. A real by-the-book guy. He lived in the area. He fit the age profile, came the name on. The disc matched. Now, all they needed was physical evidence. The FBI obtained a warrant to collect DNA from Rader's daughter, Carrie. She had no idea at the time. Agents discreetly obtained a sample from her medical records, a pap smear. It felt invasive, but necessary. When they tested the DNA, it was a familial match to semen found at several BTK crime scenes. The bloodline was clear. Dennis Rader was BTK. The investigators moved fast. They didn't want to spook him. On February 25, 2005, as he was driving home for lunch, Wichita police pulled him over on a quiet road. They surrounded the car, guns drawn, and the man who had once left women bound and strangled in basements calmly stepped out of his vehicle. When they cuffed him, he said just one thing. "Oh, I guess you got me." That was it. No drama, no panic, just resignation, like a kid caught sneaking candy. He was brought into the station for interrogation. For 30 hours, Rader sat and calmly described his crimes. All 10 murders in shocking detail. Names, dates, locations. He spoke as if he were reviewing a work project. No remorse, no shame, packed horror. He admitted to the Otero family murders, explained how he tied up 11-year-old Josephine Otero and then hanged her in the basement. He described what it was like to kill Catherine Bright, even after her brother fought back. He talked about waiting in closets, stalking women from their front yards, and drawing diagrams of homes. He confessed to wearing masks and using ropes he tied himself. He called them projects. And through it all, he referred to himself in the third person as BTK. He seemed more proud than sorry. The floppy disk, he said, was a mistake. They said it was safe, he muttered. They lied to me. In his mind, he had been betrayed, not by guilt or evidence, but by the game itself. He had asked for rules. They had tricked him. And in the twisted world of Dennis Rader, that was the ultimate sin. But to law enforcement was poetic justice. After 31 years of fear, Wichita finally had its answer. All thanks to one tiny piece of forgotten tech, a floppy disk from a killer who still thought he was the smartest man in the room. In the end, BTK wasn't caught by force. He wasn't brought down by guns or glory. He was undone by arrogance, his need for attention, his belief that he was invincible. He couldn't resist reaching out one more time, and that final message, just 1.44 megabytes long, would be his undoing. Asterisk. Dennis Rader's confessions weren't like those you see on TV. There were no dramatic cries, no sudden outbursts of remorse, no desperate attempts to plead for mercy. Instead, there was a calmness, an eerie stillness that made his admissions all the more terrifying when law enforcement finally sat down with him in 2005. After the floppy disk led them straight to his doorstep, what emerged was not just a man confessing to 10 murders. It was a glimpse into the mind of a predator who saw himself as an artist, a craftsman, a god. Rader spoke in precise, measured tones, like a man recounting a story he had told himself for years, shaping it until it fit his own twisted narrative. He referred to himself almost always in the third person, BTK. The acronym stood for bind, torture, kill, the steps he methodically followed in each of his murders. It was a chilling mantra that defined his identity. During his interrogation, he described the murders as if they were projects, something to be completed with care and patience. He often compared himself to a performer preparing for a role, an actor rehearsing lines. Each murder was an act, he said. I was the director and the audience. When asked about his motivations, Rader did not speak of hatred or rage. Instead, he talked about control. The overwhelming need to dominate and be in charge. To manipulate not just his victims, but the entire narrative surrounding him. He said, I've lived a double life. Dennis Rader was the man who went to church, who took out the trash, who was a father and a husband. BTK was the man who lived in the shadows, but he was part of me. One could not exist without the other. His confession revealed a man obsessed with secrecy. He believed that his ability to evade capture for so long was a testament to his superiority. I was smarter than everyone else. I knew how to disappear. The police were just playing catch-up. He told investigators about the importance of trophies, small objects taken from victims like jewelry, underwear, or photographs. To him, these items weren't souvenirs. They were symbols of victory, proof of his dominance. They allowed him to relive the murders over and over again in his mind. Rader also spoke about the fantasy, a recurring theme in his confession. For years, he had rehearsed these crimes mentally before committing them. The fantasy was an escape from the mundanity of his everyday life, a dark, thrilling world where he was in total control. His words sent a chill through the room when he said, the fantasy was the real crime. The act itself was only the final note. When questioned about his victims, he showed no empathy. Instead, he named them by code names, often referring to them as projects. explained that each victim was chosen carefully based on opportunity, vulnerability, and the potential for control. He stalked them for weeks or months, learning their routines, studying their homes, and planning his entry. One of the most haunting parts of his confession was how he described the moment of killing. He said he watched his victims closely, sometimes for hours, before making his move. Calculated, patient, and during the act, he described feeling a sense of power that was unmatched by anything else. But despite the horror of his actions, there was a cold detachment in his voice when he recounted these details. He spoke about the pain he caused with clinical precision, as if discussing a task rather than a crime. Rader's confession also revealed disturbing insights into his childhood and early life. He admitted to torturing animals as a child, a behavior often linked to later violent tendencies. He spoke about feelings of loneliness and being an outsider, though these emotions never led to empathy for others. Instead, they fueled his desire to control and dominate. When asked why he stopped killing in 1991, he gave a simple explanation. Boredom. The thrill faded, he said. I had done it all. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. But, as the letters and the floppy disk would later prove, that retirement was temporary. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Rader's confessions was his lack of remorse. He never apologized for the pain he caused. Instead, he expressed regret only that he was caught. His ego remained intact, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. He once told a psychologist, "I am not evil. I am a man who made choices that some may never understand." He framed his actions as a form of art, a performance, calling his ability to compartmentalize, to live a normal life while committing horrific crimes. It's what makes his case so chilling. He managed to attend church, serve as president of his congregation, tease and participate in community activities, all while hiding his dark urges. Throughout his confessions, Rader repeatedly referenced religion, often using scripture to justify or explain his actions. He believed that God had given him the power to punish what he saw as sin. This twisted faith was a key part of his identity, despite the darkness. Some experts note that Rader's confessions provide critical insight into the mind of a methodical serial killer. His detailed recounting of his crimes offers valuable information for law enforcement and psychologists alike, helping to prevent future tragedies. But for many, the confessions only deepen the horror. They strip away any illusion of humanity and expose the raw, cold heart of evil. Dennis Rader's story is a terrifying reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile at you in church. They tuck their children in at night. They live next door, and behind closed doors, they bind, torture, and kill while the world sleeps. Asterisk. When Dennis Rader was arrested in February 2005, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the city limits of Wichita, Kansas. For decades, the people of Wichita lived in fear, afraid to walk alone at night, haunted by the knowledge that somewhere among them lurked a monster known only as BTK. But now, the nightmare had a face, a name, and it was their neighbor. The trial was set to begin quickly. Prosecutors had mountains of evidence: his detailed confessions, DNA links, physical evidence from his home, and an unshakable narrative of evil. But even with this overwhelming case, preparing for the courtroom drama was far from simple. Dennis Rader, a man who had so meticulously hidden his crimes, now had to confront the public eye. He chose to represent himself, a move that stunned many. Rader seemed calm and almost detached as the court proceedings began. He asked for no mercy, no plea deals. Instead, he laid bare his story, insisting on telling his version of events in his own words. For the victims' families, the trial was a long-awaited moment of truth. Many sat quietly in the courtroom, faces etched with pain and memories too raw for words. The families of Catherine Bright, Dolores Davis, Shirley Vianne, and the Otero family, those who had lost children, sisters, mothers, were finally able to hear directly from the accused the details of their loved ones' final moments. Some cried openly, others clenched their fists, but all sat united in their grief and in their demand for justice. The prosecution presented graphic details, carefully reconstructed timelines, and chilling recordings of Rader's confessions. The evidence painted a stark picture: a man who lived a double life as a trusted community member by day and a cold-blooded killer by night. Prosecutors made it clear Rader was a remorseless predator who deliberately terrorized the community for decades. Witnesses spoke about the impact of the crimes, the fear that gripped neighborhoods, the community meetings filled with desperation, the forever changed lives. Psychologists testified about the lasting trauma inflicted, not just on victims, but on entire families and the city itself. One of the most emotional moments came when Carrie Rawson, Rader's daughter, bravely took the stand. She described her own journey from shock to survival, telling the court about the devastation of discovering her father's secret life. Her testimony reminded everyone that even within the family of a killer, pain and confusion run deep. Rader's defense was brief. He didn't deny the crimes, but framed them as a compulsion, a part of himself that he claimed he could not control. He portrayed himself as a man haunted by dark desires, trapped in his own mind, but he showed no remorse, no apologies, just a chilling, matter-of-fact recounting. The judge and jury listened in silence, weighed by the gravity of the evidence and the lives shattered behind every fact. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was packed. The families of the victims gathered to hear the final word. The judge didn't mince words. Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence ensuring he would never see the outside world again. As the judge read the sentence aloud, a heavy silence filled the room, relief mixed with sorrow. Justice had been served, but it could never heal the wounds. For the families, the verdict was bittersweet. They had waited decades for this moment, but the pain of loss remained as raw as ever. For many, the sentence was a closure they had feared would never come. Dennis Rader was immediately transferred to a maximum security prison. Even there, he remained a figure of fascination and fear. Interviews with prison staff reveal a man who continues to maintain a chilling calmness, showing no remorse and rarely speaking about his crimes without detachment. The trial and sentencing of BTK sent a powerful message that even the most cunning killers who think they can evade justice for years will eventually be caught, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will come to light, and that the voices of victims and their families matter, demanding recognition, closure, and justice. In the years since the trial, Wichita has slowly healed. Community events remember the victims. Scholarships and memorials keep their memories alive. And survivors like Carrie Rawson continue to advocate for victims of violent crime, reminding the world that healing is possible even after unspeakable horror. The BTK case remains one of the most haunting chapters in American criminal history, a terrifying example of how evil can hide in plain sight, and how perseverance, science, and courage can bring light to the darkest places. Asterisk. Dennis Rader's life behind bars is a stark contrast to the normalcy he portrayed for decades outside prison walls. After his sentencing in 2005, he was transferred to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, a maximum security prison designed to house the state's most dangerous criminals. Yet, despite the heavy security and the constant supervision, Rader's presence still casts a long shadow. Inside those cold, concrete walls, Rader's world shrank. Gone were the church meetings, the family dinners, the neighborhood strolls. Instead, Days passed in monotonous repetition, hours marked by the ringing of bells, the shuffling of feet, and the occasional clang of a metal door. Unlike many prisoners who become aggressive or withdrawn, Rader maintained a chilling calm. Prison guards describe him as quiet but watchful, someone who carefully follows rules but never reveals much. He keeps to himself, often spending hours reading or writing books on theology, law, and psychology, lying his sparse cell, reflecting the complex, conflicted man beneath those separated physically from society. Rader has not been silent. Over the years, he has participated in numerous psychological evaluations and interviews with researchers, law enforcement, and journalists, hoping to explain or perhaps justify his crimes. In these interviews, Rader often revisits his old narratives, explaining his actions with a disturbing mixture of pride and detachment. He repeats the idea of living a double life, portraying himself as both Dennis, the obedient citizen, and BTK, the dark force lurking beneath. Yet, despite his calm exterior, glimpses of inner conflict sometimes surface. Psychologists who have evaluated him describe Rader as a master manipulator, someone who can appear sincere and cooperative while subtly controlling conversations. They note his lack of empathy, his superficial charm, and his dangerous grandiosity. But beyond that, some detect a man trapped by his own compulsions, isolated not only by prison walls, but by his fractured mind. Rader's letters from prison reveal more of his complex personality. In one, he writes about the weight of guilt and the loneliness that comes from knowing he destroyed not only his victims, but his own family. In another, he questions his own faith, wrestling with how a man who committed such evil could believe in God. Yet, even with this introspection, he never fully admits to feeling true remorse. Instead, he often frames his crimes as an expression of something greater, a dark calling or destiny. Over the years, Rader has made several attempts to correspond with the families of his victims, sometimes offering vague apologies. These letters are often met with silence or rejection, understandable responses from those who have suffered unspeakable loss. The prison environment itself offers little comfort. Maximum security facilities are designed to isolate and control, not rehabilitate. Rader spends most days alone under constant watch, with limited contact with other inmates or visitors. Despite this, he has found ways to exert influence, maintaining control over his own narrative through written words and interviews. Some experts warn that even behind bars, killers like Rader can perpetuate harm, psychologically tormenting victims. Families are manipulating public perception for Wichita and the wider community. Rader's imprisonment brings mixed emotions. There is relief that he will never harm anyone again, yet the scars he left run deep, and his presence in prison serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that once lurked in their midst. Meanwhile, new generations grow up knowing BTK as part of their city's history, a cautionary tale about the dangers hidden behind everyday smiles. Schools discuss the case as part of crime education. Documentaries and books explore the lessons learned. Survivors and families continue their journey toward healing. The story of Dennis Rader's life in prison is far from over. As decades pass, he remains a figure of fascination and fear, a man imprisoned not just by bars, but by the legacy of his own monstrous actions. In some ways, his final chapter is still being written, whether through therapy, letters, or the rare interviews he grants. The world watches, hoping for insights, answers, maybe even redemption, but above all, waiting for the day when the echoes of BTK finally fade into silence. Because in the end, no prison walls can hold the memories of those lost, and no sentence can erase the pain. Dennis Rader's life behind bars is a testament, a warning and a reminder that evil can wear a mask for years, but it can never escape the truth forever. The story of Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK, did not end with his arrest, trial, or imprisonment. his shadow lingers still, etched deeply into the heart of Wichita, Kansas, and remembered far beyond its borders. Over decades, his horrific crimes transformed a community, leaving scars that time alone cannot erase. But they also sparked conversations, actions, the legacy that continues to shape how Wichita and the world remember victims, face evil, and seek justice. For the people of Wichita, BTK is not just a chapter in true crime history. He is a reminder of vulnerability and resilience. The city was forever changed the day they learned a monster had lived among them for decades, hiding behind the mask of a church-going family man. That revelation shook every street, every neighborhood, and every household. The trust that once cradled the community was fractured, but not broken. In the immediate aftermath of Rader's arrest and trial, Wichita came together in an outpouring of grief and solidarity. Vigils were held in parks and churches. Candles were lit in memory of those taken too soon. Community leaders urged residents to support the victims' families and each other. The city, despite its pain, refused to be defined solely by fear. One of the most powerful responses was the establishment of memorials and scholarships honoring the victims. These acts of remembrance ensured that the lives lost would never be forgotten, even as time marches on. The Otero family, Dolores Davis, Shirley Vianne, Oz, and others were given names etched in stone and hearts. Carrie Rawson, Dennis Rader's daughter, has been a central figure in keeping the victims' memories alive. After years of personal struggle, she transformed her story into advocacy, speaking openly about trauma, healing, and the importance of remembering. Through interviews, books, and speaking engagements, Carrie has helped humanize a tragedy that might otherwise be reduced to statistics and headlines. The BTK case also helped push law enforcement and forensic technology forward. The use of digital forensics, especially the analysis of metadata on the floppy disk that led to Rader's capture, showcased how evolving technology can crack even the most cold-blooded criminals. Wichita's police department became a model for cooperation between local and federal agencies, highlighting the importance of persistence and innovation in solving cold cases. Beyond Wichita, BTK's story has entered the wider cultural consciousness. Documentaries, podcasts, and books have dissected the case, often exploring the chilling juxtaposition of Rader's normal life and monstrous acts. The case serves as a cautionary tale reminding society that evil can wear any face, and vigilance is vital. Psychologists and criminologists study BTK to better understand the mind of a serial killer who managed to maintain a double life. His ability to compartmentalize challenges assumptions about what drives such criminals and informs prevention and rehabilitation efforts worldwide. Yet, the legacy is not only about the past, it's about the ongoing impact on survivors, families, and communities who live with trauma and loss. The victims' families often speak about the importance of public remembrance. Not for fame or spectacle, but to acknowledge their loved ones' lives and the injustices they endured. BTK also left a cultural imprint on Wichita itself. Local schools discuss the case as part of criminal justice and history classes. The story of BTK is a solemn lesson in both human darkness and the resilience of community. It is woven into the city's identity not as a badge of shame, but as a call to never forget and to strive for a safer, more compassionate society. Moreover, BTK's story has opened conversations about the nature of evil and the complexities of human psychology. It challenges people to consider how someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such horrors and what signs, if any, might have been missed. This reflection has fueled efforts in mental health awareness and early intervention, seeking to prevent tragedies before they occur. As the years pass, the memory of BTK grows more distant, but no less significant. New generations learn about the case through books, media, and local storytelling. The victims' names are spoken with reverence. Lessons are passed on. Wichita continues to heal slowly, steadily building a future where the darkness BTK cast is met with light, where victims are honored and survivors supported, where the community stands vigilant, united, stronger than the shadows of the past. Dennis Rader's legacy is a complex one. It is a story of unspeakable horror, yes, but also of endurance, remembrance, and the unbreakable spirit of a city that refused to be defeated. And in remembering Wichita, the world choose hope. Asterisk. The story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, did not end when he was arrested, tried, and sentenced. In many ways, his infamy grew even larger after his capture, spilling into the realms of media, movies, podcasts, and books, shaping the modern true crime culture and captivating audiences worldwide. But this spotlight on BTK also raises important questions about how we consume stories of violence and tragedy. From the moment BTK's name entered headlines, journalists and filmmakers sensed a story with all the hallmarks of a dark thriller. A seemingly ordinary man living a secret double life, decades of unsolved murders, taunting letters to police, and a final capture thanks to an old floppy disk. This narrative seemed tailor-made for gripping documentaries and chilling dramatizations. Almost immediately, documentaries sprang up, detailing the timeline of Rader's crimes and his eventual capture. One of the earliest and most impactful was a 2006 documentary produced by the Investigation Discovery Network, which delved deep into the psychology of BTK and interviewed detectives involved in the case. It humanized the victims and explored the chilling normalcy of Rader's life. In 2007, the case was featured in several true crime TV shows like Forensic Files and the FBI Files, where reenactments dramatized the investigations, twists, and turns. These shows drew millions of viewers, fascinated by the intersection of technology, psychology, and law enforcement that led to BTK's downfall. The true crime book market embraced the story with open arms. Authors raced to write comprehensive accounts detailing Rader's early life, his victims, and the painstaking police work. Carrie Rawson's memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter, published in 2019, offered a unique and deeply personal perspective, exposing the pain and resilience within a family shattered by unimaginable secrets. BTK's story also found its way to feature films and dramatized series. In 2005, a TV movie titled BTK, A Killer Among Us portrayed the man behind the mask, walking audiences through his twisted psychology and the terror he inflicted. These dramatizations often spark debate. Do they help educate and honor victims? Or do they risk sensationalizing tragedy for entertainment? Podcasts, a more recent medium, have brought a new wave of engagement with BTK's case. Popular true crime podcasts have devoted multiple episodes to dissecting the killer's methods, psychology, and the impact on Wichita. The intimate, conversational style of podcasts invites listeners to wrestle with the ethical challenges of consuming stories of real-life horror, questioning where the line lies between awareness and exploitation. BTK's story fits into a larger cultural fascination with serial killers, a fascination with understanding what makes a monster tick and how evil can hide in plain sight. Yet this fascination carries weight. True crime media often walks a fine line, balancing between educating the public and respecting victims and their families. With BTK, the stakes feel even higher given the prolonged trauma inflicted on the Wichita community. Critics argue that some portrayals risk glamorizing the killer, giving him notoriety he craved. They worry about murderabilia merchandise, souvenirs, memorabilia related to serial killers, and how it can cause further harm. Survivors and victims advocates often call for media to prioritize dignity and respect in their storytelling. On the other hand, supporters of true crime media point to its value in raising awareness, prompting cold case investigations, and educating audiences about the warning signs of violent behavior. In BTK's case, media attention helped keep the investigation alive and ensured the victims were not forgotten. This tension continues to influence how BTK's story is told. New documentaries and series strive to include voices from victims, families, psychologists, and law enforcement to provide a fuller picture. They aim to tell the story not just of a killer, but of the enduring human cost and the community's strength in the aftermath. BTK's presence in popular culture also highlights the evolution of true crime storytelling, from early sensationalist reports to today's more nuanced narratives. There is growing awareness of the responsibility storytellers have toward the people behind the headlines. In the end, the tale of Dennis Rader, the man who bound, tortured, and killed, serves as both a chilling caution and a reflection on how society confronts evil. His legacy in media is complex, a mixture of education, fascination, and ethical debate. As viewers and listeners, the question remains, how do we engage with stories of darkness without losing sight of the humanity beneath? Dennis Rader, the man behind the chilling BTK acronym, taught us many hard lessons. His story is a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting the worst that can hide behind the most ordinary faces. But it also serves as a call to action, a reminder to listen, to watch, and to care. Even when evil seems distant or disguised, the BTK case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity. It challenges the notion that monsters are obvious. Dennis Rader wasn't a shadowy figure lurking on the fringes. He was a father, a husband, a church council president, man who mowed his lawn, attended meetings, and blended seamlessly into community life. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes from his everyday persona teaches us that appearances can deceive. One crucial lesson is the importance of vigilance. For years, BTK operated with impunity because suspicion never fell on him. Friends, neighbors, even family members were blind to the darkness he concealed. This underscores the need for awareness, without paranoia, of the signs that might indicate someone is struggling with dangerous impulses. Recognizing red flags in behavior, whether cueing ourselves or others, is vital in preventing tragedies. The case also highlights the vital role of law enforcement's persistence. Keys passed with few leads, yet police never gave up. They adapted. As technology evolved from fingerprint analysis to DNA testing and finally digital forensics, the floppy disk that unraveled BTK's identity reminds us that even the smallest detail can bring justice. Patience and innovation in investigation can save lives. Another lesson lies in the power of victims' voices and families. The pain, grief, and resilience of those left behind demand recognition, courage in facing public attention. Trauma, and sometimes stigma, teaches us about strength and the human capacity to heal. Memorials, advocacy, and storytelling keep the memory of victims alive and push society to prioritize support for survivors of violence. Psychologically, BTK's story deepens our understanding of criminal minds. Rader exemplifies how psychopathy and compulsion can coexist with superficial normalcy. His confessions reveal a man driven by control, fantasy, and a warped sense of morality. Studying his behavior helps psychologists and law enforcement develop better profiling and prevention techniques. It also raises questions about how early intervention might have changed his path. The case serves as a caution against complacency. It reminds us that evil can evolve, hide, and wait. The periods when BTK ceased communication did not mean he had disappeared. Sometimes silence is just another tactic. Staying vigilant about unsolved cases and cold leads is essential. Ethically, the BTK story challenges how society consumes true crime. It asks us to balance curiosity with respect, to remember victims as people, not just plot points. This lesson urges media creators, audiences, and educators to approach such stories thoughtfully, emphasizing empathy over sensationalism. On a broader scale, the BTK legacy teaches us about community resilience, which is his response to terror. Coming together to mourn, remember, and rebuild demonstrates the strength found in unity. Communities that support victims and foster open dialogue can transform tragedy into growth. BTK also spotlights the importance of mental health awareness, understanding the signs of psychological distress and providing accessible help could prevent some violent acts. While not all violence stems from mental illness, addressing emotional and behavioral issues early remains critical. In the end, Dennis Rader's story is a stark warning, causing us to never take safety for granted, to question what lies beneath surface appearances, to stand with victims and survivors, to support efforts that prevent future harm. But it is also a story of hope. Hope that justice can be served, even after decades. Hope that communities can heal. Hope that knowledge gained can protect others. As we close this chapter on BTK, the echoes of his crimes remind us that darkness exists, but so does light. And it is up to each of us to be that light, vigilant, compassionate, and unwavering in the pursuit of justice, because remembering is not enough. We must learn, we must act, and in doing so, we honor those lost not just with words, but with deeds. Asterisk.